Welcome back, everybody, to Chapter 3 of the story of the Turkish century from the Hittites to Atatürk. I'm excited to continue this conversation. We're only going to be looking at just the one chapter today. If you didn't see my reaction to parts 1 and 2 from the channel known as Kraut, that was yesterday. I'll put a link in the description to my first part reaction as well as to the original video. Seems like a lot of you are excited that I'm diving into this. I wasn't sure how it would go on the channel. You know, we are primarily, 50% of our audience is the United States. Another 20% is the UK and Germany. So I wasn't sure how the reaction would be, but it's been very, very positive, and I appreciate that, and I'm glad to see that. And I especially want to give a shout out and a thank you to the folks on the channel, and I know there are quite a few of you who are of Turkish descent. Also our Muslim friends who have been helping me, both Turkish and Muslim friends who have been helping kind of fill in the gaps in my own understanding of some things. So thank you to all of you who responded. As I've said before, and I'll say again, I read every single comment on every video. With the growth of this channel nearing 200,000 subscribers, we went over 180 last night. I can't always respond to everything, but I do read them all. So I appreciate those, and please keep those coming. Let's go ahead and dive into part 3.
Over the centuries, from 600 to 1200, the Turkic expansion created a vast Turkic cultural sphere of many a Turkic people. It stretched from Siberia to Anatolia, and as the Mongols emerged from the vast horde lands of the east, their conquest of Asia didn't just result in a mere subjugation of Turkic tribes and kingdoms, but in massive migration of Turkic peoples. From Central Asia to Persia and the Caucasus, many Turkic peoples packed and fled in search of refuge, and they mostly ended up in the lands of the Seljuks, thereby establishing a large Turkish population in Anatolia. The Seljuks themselves fell to the Mongols, and the 1300s were dominated by the Taifas, little petty kingdoms, warlords, and tribes that bickered and fought amongst themselves for control over the others and dominance.
So, and a bunch of you commented on the country ball thing, how, it is a really good way, I'm noticing, to really kind of understand the situation. And obviously, for example, with some of these, we're looking at Stars of David. So the implication there is that these are parts of the Jewish diaspora. These are people that are Jewish in background that are parts of these small people groups. And so I'm interested to know how they would have interacted with the Muslim people groups, and obviously then there were Christians, but not too many Christians in this area. I'm thinking primarily of Georgia being kind of one of the small bastions of Christianity in the midst of all of those other things that are happening. But I'm curious to know how that all is going to play out.
But they had a great advantage compared to the others defeated by the Mongols, the Zagros mountain range, stretching from the Caucasus to the Gulf. This vast range of mountains protects whoever rules Iran, but it also locks them into Iran, making it hard to sally forth into the Middle East or Anatolia. And at a certain point it was simply no longer worthwhile to launch large expeditions to ensure the Anatolian Turks stayed in line. The most powerful of them was the Rum Sultanate, the successors to the Seljuk throne. One of the least powerful was a little state whose rulers originally came from Central Asia and had fled west from the Mongols, the Ottomans. While much of the Middle East had been flung into chaos through the Mongol invasion, the Ottomans managed to build a sphere of stability in their realm. This attracted craftsmen, intellectuals, and trade, while also providing the Ottomans with the stability required to go out and hassle others.
So isn't it interesting that some of the great empires of the world start out as almost like the afterthought, or some of the great people of the world start out as the afterthought? For example, you could look at Rome and look at that triumvirate of Pompey Magnus, of Crassus, and of Julius Caesar. And of the three, at least initially, Julius Caesar's kind of the afterthought of the three, but he's the one everybody knows today. The Ottomans are the little group compared to all of these other great powers that are warring all over the place, but they create stability, and they kind of, I'm guessing, just sit back and watch everybody else weaken each other. When you play the game Risk, sometimes that's how you can win. You can be the weakest power on the board for most of the game, But as the other great powers weaken each other, at some point you have that opportunity to jump in and just take over everything. I'm guessing that's what's going to happen with the Ottomans, but I could be wrong about that.
Those others mainly being the Byzantines. But the Ottomans didn't just go charge into war as the Seljuks had. And of course they went through spats of conquest here and then, but the Ottomans mainly subdued the Byzantines through diplomacy, politics, and patience.
Smart,
they married
patience.
Byzantine princesses, schemed within the politics of the Byzantine royal court, promised the Byzantines support against the Bulgars, Venetians.
They played Crusader Kings is what they did. I mean, if you play the game, that's how you do it. You intermarry into the right places, you use diplomacy, you get the right friends on your side, and then you conquer when you're able to. Brilliant strategy.
And Serbs, but used those promises to just take lands previously owned by the Byzantines, then conquered by others, and to not give them back. By the turn of the century, the Ottomans had established a firm grip over the Balkans and western Anatolia, and that gave them an enormous strategic advantage over the other caliphates and the Seljuks and everyone else who had come before them from the Middle East and Iran and attempted to conquer the Mediterranean. Access to the resources of these lands would further Ottoman conquest for more power elsewhere. It gave them a place of some tranquility as the Mongol hordes invaded Anatolia again. But to understand the complete significance, we have to look at maps and ships. Seafaring was extremely dangerous for most of human history, and mostly involved coast hopping.
Yeah.
You would sail along the coastline, always in sight of said coastline. And
the reason being that if you couldn't see the coastline, this is before the age when there was enough knowledge about navigation to be able to navigate without the coastline. We use the stars and things like that, but that only takes you so far. So keeping that sight of the coastline kept your bearings and helped you to understand where you were, and also helped you to very quickly get back to shore if you needed to.
And at all costs avoid the open ocean as much as you possibly could. The means to navigate the vast open seas were simply not available, and getting lost out of sight of the coast was tantamount to a death sentence. This, of course, cancelled out most of the Atlantic as any means of transportation by sea, but transport by sea was still faster and more efficient than transport by land, so it was still worth the risk heading out and hopping along the coastline. The Mediterranean, however, was different. It was mostly calm, but far more important, it had peninsulas, lots of peninsulas, all over the place. And when you look at these maps, it is also useful to forget the current geopolitical boundaries and borders. 1,000 years ago, the concept of Europe as a uniform entity of some shared culture or values would have made no sense. What, however, would have made sense would have been to categorize the region around the Mediterranean as its own entity, a kind of Mediterranean sphere of culture and influence.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, it's not like today where here's France and Germany and all these countries, and this is all Europe, this is Africa, this is Asia. Really, the Mediterranean is the sphere, and that's a very, I give this guy a lot of credit. He really does a good job of setting kind of the stage and helping us to understand how things were at the time and getting us out of the mindset of modern day, because that's how you have to look at this stuff. That's how you have to look at any period in history. You have to look at it as they saw it, not as we see it today, because as we see it today, it doesn't make sense. But this is basically the Roman world. If you think about the Roman Empire, you add a little bit to it here and there, but pretty much that's how it was. And there's a reason for that. Again, because of access to the Mediterranean, access to the sea. It makes a lot of sense.
People in the Levant would have had more interactions with people in Sicily than people in Sicily would have had with people from the North Sea. Add to that the Egyptian breadbasket, and you have a region that many empires came to try and rule for themselves. Especially in these regions, the Adriatic, the Aegean, the Black Sea, and in particular, the Dardanelles. In these waters, it is close to impossible to get lost at sea. Almost like lakes, no matter where you head, you will almost certainly at some point hit land in close vicinity. This means that you didn't need to hop along the coastline as much, and that you could tax, police, and control all traffic going through these segments of ocean. This allowed for specialization in nautical transport and warfare, and consequently it should not surprise you that prior to the 16th century, most European and Middle Eastern empires happened to be those who controlled those straits.
Yeah, so there again, I mean, that's exactly what I was just talking about, where you're looking at those empires, Rome, Greece, the Persians, etc. Same kind of deal.
This is a great springboard to go out and conquer the rest of the Mediterranean. And what about the Mediterranean? What makes it so special? It is again the fact that ocean travel was limited to coast hopping. To the people of the time, the oceans were vast, deep pits of certain death. Siberia was empty horde lands with close to no means of large-scale transportation. So if you owned the eastern Mediterranean, you controlled all trade between west and east.
And look at where Turkey is, right in the middle of all of that. You start to understand the strategic location. So not only have we talked about the strategic resources that they have, the strategic defensible position they have with the mountains being close to the coast. Now you get into strategic location between the area of the Mediterranean that's been fought over, by the Romans, the Greeks, and others, the Persians, and the East, where you're going to have the spice trade and things of that nature. And of course, it's the land route coming up from Africa, and in particular Egypt, where you've got so much of the grain supply and things of that nature.
Be it the spices from India or silk from China, all of it had to go through the eastern Mediterranean. And if you controlled that, you could tax it. Before the 17th century, the geography of the eastern Mediterranean was geography that made its owners superpowers. Then there's also the breadbasket, specifically Mesopotamia and Egypt. Both these regions have the benefit of the most fertile lands in the region combined with a mild climate. This consistently produced the regular surplus in grain, which in return could feed vast empires, while most lands elsewhere had to consistently face regular famines due to crop failures and other agricultural disadvantages. Those who owned Egypt could guarantee a regular, not just supply, but a surplus of food for its own population, allowing them to focus their attention elsewhere and expand.
And remember, we talked in the last episode about how when you make that transition to where you're not just feeding yourself, but you're producing enough to feed others, that then allows for things like specialization in building an army, building trades, building, in general, just construction and things like that. And now you're not only feeding yourselves and all your people, you're able to produce enough to feed everybody else too, which makes you ideal in terms of conquest. Everybody wants Egypt. Egypt isn't just a big desert. It's the place all the food comes from.
As much as we like to think of the Ottomans as a historical entity that represents an Islamic force trying to conquer Europe, the reality of the matter is that the Ottomans mainly pursued rule over the Mediterranean, because most powers before them had done so as well, and because of the enormous geopolitical value of the Mediterranean before the 1700s.
And if these people are viewing themselves as the successors to Rome, it only makes sense that they conquer former Roman territory.
And the first step to controlling the Mediterranean was completed by the 1450s, when the Ottomans ended the Byzantines and controlled most of the Balkans, Marmara, the Bosporus, and the Aegean coastline. The Ottomans made Constantinople their new capital and transformed the city dramatically. Under the Byzantines, the city had stretched along the southern end of the Golden Horn. Under the Ottomans, over the next 2 centuries, the city expanded into all directions to include the entire Golden Horn and both sides of the Bosporan Straits. The massive city would come to dominate international trade for the next 200 years, and also would be the harbour from which an enormous Ottoman fleet would try to conquer and control the Mediterranean. Beginning what we now know as the Era of Transformation. That massive navy helped conquer the Black Sea coastline and Crimea, as well as solidify Ottoman control over Greece. Meanwhile, in the south, Egypt and the Levant had been ruled by the Mamelukes, an incompetent series of squabbling dynasties that were unable to put up much resistance to an Ottoman conquest of their lands, which then pushed further to conquer North Africa, Mesopotamia, and Arabia.
Look at the size of that empire at this point. Look at how much land they have. Look at how far toward Central Europe they're pushing. I mean, they're pushing right up to the edge of places like Austria and southern Germany. Obviously, these aren't countries that exist as we know them today. I'm just trying to put perspective in terms of the map. They've got everything that you would consider modern-day Romania, Bulgaria, and what became Yugoslavia, and Greece. And this is a mammoth empire, and of course they've got all the natural resources. They've got a good bit of the Mediterranean. It's really a wonder they didn't go further.
from where the last of the Abbasid caliphs was dragged to Istanbul to abdicate the title of caliph to the Ottoman Sultan. With that done, they were now the center of the Islamic world. They controlled and taxed all Silk Road trade to Europe, had the largest navy in the Mediterranean, and they had access to the Indian Ocean, which they would also try to control.
Lots of money.
But there's something important which we might be missing here. People tend to live in a society. We can look at maps and economics as much as we want, but fundamentally an empire or nation-state construct of any sort is always a society, and without a coherent social fabric holding it all together, societies tend to collapse into themselves.
And this is the problem throughout history with empires that contain vastly different people groups. Look at the Austro-Hungarians in Europe in the the 1900s, well, in the beginning of 1900s. They couldn't hold it all together because they've got these vastly different people groups, different religions, different ethnicities, different languages, who all have their own kind of desire for freedom, desire for autonomy. You're dealing with that here in the Ottoman Empire as well.
So what was this Ottoman society like? And how did the social fabric of this society keep such a large and diverse empire together for 400 years? The reason is because at the time, it was one of the few empires that actually had a social structure that could sustain an empire. It tolerated differences. It is easy to forget that before the 1900s, Anatolia's population was 1/3 non-Muslim. In general, there were times at which this Islamic caliphate had a larger Christian population than a Muslim population.
That's really fascinating because, look at and obviously Jews as well. That's kind of the flag of Israel there. That was a key. This is a time when you've got Christians and Muslims living in a Muslim-dominated culture and empire where those things are tolerated. Now, look at the other side. Look at the Christian nations. Look at places like Spain and others where there were very tiny. Spain, there was a much greater Muslim population, and Spain didn't exist as a country anyway. I'm just trying to kind of create a picture here. A lot of the Christian nations were dominated by Christians. They didn't have large Jewish or non-Christian populations, and there was much more antipathy toward them. There was much less tolerance for people who weren't Christians or even the right kind of Christians. You can see how that had to have been a necessity for the Ottoman Empire because they had such a large population of people who weren't Muslim. They had to be willing to tolerate those people as to prevent an uprising.
On average, Greeks living in the Ottoman Empire were wealthier than the average Turks, because the Greeks had built a large network of trade over centuries that the Ottomans didn't just take from them, but just taxed. Armenian craftsmen helped build the Ottoman navy and their new expanded capital, Istanbul. And the reason for this is because under the Islamic laws, which were the laws of the empire, all these groups were tolerated. We also have to keep in mind that in that time, group identities barely ever exceeded across the borders and limitations of the village that a person resided in. A concept such as a nationalistic tribal identity built on grounds of language or ethnicity wasn't prevalent. And people to an empire are first and foremost one thing, a resource, probably the most valuable resource there is. And the Ottomans were one of the few empires of the time who understood that and welcomed that resource wherever they could receive it. When Spain expelled its Jews, it was the Ottomans who jumped in to welcome them. And that tolerance that made life in a religious hierarchy possible gave the Ottomans enormous advantages over their contemporaries. Arab caliphates, in comparison, tended to overly stigmatize non-Muslim groups, enforced Arab tribal structures over subjects, and were regularly subjected to anti-Jewish programs and expulsions. Europe was at that time consumed by religious hatred. If you were Catholic, living in Protestant lands was not a good idea. Neither was the reverse. The resulting conflicts bogged Europe down into massive bloodlettings such as the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War that stifled innovation and expansion.
So it's an interesting thing to think about. You've got Christians fighting Christians in Europe, whereas in the Ottoman Empire at this time, you've got Muslims who are tolerating people who disagree. Obviously there were different kinds of Muslims with Sunnis and Shias, but they've also got Jews, they've also got Eastern Orthodox Christians, they've got these other people groups, and they're like, hey, we're cool. You do your thing. We're going to rule this as the Muslim empire, but you're free to exist within that. Pay your taxes, support the empire. other parts of the world that wasn't happening. So you can see how this creates an opportunity for them to thrive during that time.
While within the Ottoman Empire, differing religious groups were tolerated, and this gave the Ottomans an enormous benefit in building and sustaining internal stability, but to also take advantage of external conflict. When the Ottomans, for example, marched on Vienna, they were joined and supported by Hungarian Protestants, who no longer wished to live under Austrian Catholic Habsburg rule. On a side note, there's an Austrian racial slur for Hungarians that developed out of this historic event, Kotásek, which means cross-carrying Turks. But it would be unwise as...
But it should be noted as well that there were likewise Muslims fighting on the side of the Europeans during the siege of Vienna. I think there were Tatars and fighting with the Polish, for example, things like that. So there was kind of that. It wasn't just Christian versus Muslim. It was Christians and Muslims versus Muslims and Christians sometimes.
As many unfortunately do today, to see this as a glorified, tolerant Islamic past. For one, and probably most importantly, there's a big difference between being tolerated and having rights as a person. The main difference being that one of them is a long list of guarantees to you as a person for your safety, life and well-being. The other is a list of all the things you cannot do, mostly dictated by a majority to an oppressed minority. The tolerance under the Ottomans, from our modern lens, was preferable to the intolerance of its neighbors, but it was just that, a condescending tolerance. Under Sharia law, a non-Muslim is a lesser being. A non-Muslim pays special taxes, has no access to legal protections that Muslims may have. His testimony against a Muslim will always be rejected in courts, which by extension means Muslims have a free hand to commit crimes against non-Muslims without facing any consequences. Non-Muslims are forbidden from owning a means of transportation, are forbidden from building new houses of worship.
And it should be noted that these same kinds of restrictions would have existed in Christian nations toward Muslims or Jews. Sometimes, like he said, even worse. They just wouldn't even tolerate your existence. But it's good to point this out, and we need to understand that even in today's culture, there's a difference between equal rights and being tolerated. And that should be noted.
Were forbidden from publicly practicing their faith and lived in segregated ghettos. From our modern lens, this is unacceptable, but even this discriminatory standard of living was preferable over the chaos and madness of Europe at the time, where worshipping the wrong god simply got you burned alive. If you were to travel back...
Or even as simple as translating the Bible from Latin and Greek into your language so that people could read it. If you were in England and translated the Bible into English for a good bit of history, that could get you burned at the stake. Eventually that was allowed, obviously even endorsed by people like King James.
For time into the Ottoman Empire, at the height of its power, calling the first official you encountered a Turk or even an Ottoman would have earned you a weird look, and the response, "You are in the Roman Empire," as that is what the empire saw itself as. After taking Constantinople, they proclaimed themselves to be the legitimate heirs of the Roman Empire. This was also a society of multiple languages, from Turkish to Persian to Arabic to Armenian, Greek and Hebrew. And languages were also separated by class, not only within the Islamic religious hierarchy, but by social status. Few people outside of the Ottoman Arab lands spoke Arabic. The language was reserved to be the language of religion and the mosque.
So it's to them what Latin would have been to the Christians at the time.
Spoke Turkish, but the Sultan, the royal family and the royal court all spoke Persian, as they had held on to the court traditions and practices of the Seljuks, and also saw themselves as the legitimate rulers of Iran.
So this is also, there are parallels here with places like England, where even though they were in England, the language of the court was French, and they saw themselves as the rightful heirs of France. Because these were people who had been Norman and had invaded England, and so they kept all of that French culture and language and everything. So a lot of parallels here.
Which leads us to another often overlooked fact. We like to often think of the Ottomans as the great rivals of Russia or the Habsburgs, but the reality is that they mostly fought their wars with dynasties ruling Iran, as they wished to incorporate Iran into their empire. The Ottoman transformation period lasted for 2 centuries, throughout which it was at the height of its reach and the predominant power of the hemisphere. But as we all know, that empire came to gradually, over the course of its remaining 2 centuries, to collapse into itself.
And my understanding is, and I could be wrong about this, that that's largely based on who was ruling, and they just had a successive bunch of really weak rulers that just got progressively worse. But I'm curious to learn and see if my understanding of that is right, or if there's a lot more to it than that. I'm guessing there probably is. Let me know your thoughts. There's a lot we just did right there, but that was only one chapter, chapter 3. There's a lot more to cover. I'm going to be taking a couple of days off before we come back to this, but we are going to continue this all the way through, and I do know that there are other things. There's more to the Turkish Century series than just this, and we will eventually get to those as well. But I just don't want to get kind of Turkish history fatigue, so we're taking this in chunks. We'll come back to it again in a couple of days and finish all of this first part out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.